The Dead Sea. Here in the desolate wilderness, a majestic mesa rises 1,300 feet straight up from the desert floor. It is known as Masada, and it attracts people from the four corners of the earth. The question is, why? 2,000 years ago, a desperate confrontation took place between Roman centurions and Hebrew rebels on these sun-baked old stones on the shores near the Dead Sea. Rather than be taken alive by the Romans, almost 1,000 Hebrew rebels enter into a suicide pact to take their own lives. Or at least, that is what everyone believes.
When you consider the final acts of Masada, it's very important to be clear about this. It was not a mass suicide. It was a mass murder. Then one man killed himself, and that's one suicide.
If everyone killed themselves on top of Masada, how can it ever be known what happened here? There is one voice, and only one voice, to tell us about Masada, the historian Josephus.
Since we, long ago, my generous friends, resolved never to be servants to the Romans, nor to any other than to God himself, the time now comes that obliges us to make that resolution true in practice. Let our wives die before they are abused, and our children before they have tasted slavery. Josephus, The Jewish War, Book 7.
But even Josephus himself was not an eyewitness, and as it turns out, he may have had a hidden agenda for telling the story this way. Just who was this mysterious Josephus, and what exactly happened here on this mountaintop 2,000 years ago? And why are people still coming here from all over the world? These are but a few of the secrets we will investigate on Mysteries of the Bible. Sunrise at Masada, a place of majesty, a place forbidding. It is so remote and so intemperately hot, it can only be approached in the very earliest light of day. And yet, in a seemingly never-ending stream, people come to see this place, to be in this place, rising straight up from the lowest and most desolate wilderness on earth. It is also in these towering bluffs at sunrise that the most elite graduates of the Armored Corps of Israel's Defense Forces take their oath of allegiance. I swear. And why do people from all over the world come to this dusty, desolate corner of the Dead Sea in the Judean wilderness and brave a difficult climb at dawn? There is no direct mention of Masada in the Bible, yet, interestingly, it is located in eastern Holy Land, very close to some of the greatest places in Jewish history: Jerusalem, Jericho, and the possible sites of Sodom and Gomorrah. In the Bible's account of David's fleeing from Saul into the wilderness, the word stronghold was originally Metzadot, or Metzada in biblical Hebrew.
And David stayed in the desert strongholds and in the hills of the desert wilderness of Ziph. 1 Samuel 23:14.
There are those who believe the word has changed with time into Masada. The essence of the mystery of Masada lies in the 1st century after Christ, in a desperate standoff between Hebrew zealots and the Romans atop this mesa, a standoff that has taken on the dimensions of legend and of mystery. But the story of Masada actually begins a century earlier, back in the century before Jesus was born, back when the Holy Land was ruled by a tyrant named King Herod the Great. As king of Judea by Roman permission, Herod would try to hold tight the reins of power for 4 uneasy decades until his death, just a few years before the beginning of the Common Era. But Herod was held in contempt by most of the Jews in the Israel of his day because he was a half-breed and because he was a ruthless tyrant.
Herod disallowed public gatherings or normal community life, and all activity was watched. Those who obstinately refused to adapt to such social constraints, he punished in all kinds of ways. Josephus, Antiquities, Book 15.
His claim to fame was, first of all, that he was married to the king's granddaughter, or engaged at least. Second of all, he was the richest man. Third of all, he was a friend of the Romans, especially of Mark Antony. And fourth of all, that he was at least twice as smart as anybody else there. With a combination of these things, Herod claimed the throne of Judea and seized it by force, and they hated him.
King Herod was originally an Idumean, that is to say, from southern Palestine, who was able to get himself made king of the Jews by the Romans in about 38 BCE. He was a man who, to tell the truth, was pretty sick. He killed off his wives and children, and he basically had a reign of terror in Palestine during his long rule.
But there were those determined to block Herod's ascendancy to the throne, and Herod would look to Rome for additional troops. And so it was that this man, this feared and hated and paranoid ruler, would go to the most remote corner of the wilderness to build a virtually impenetrable fortress, perched on a towering mesa known as Masada.
This is a very, very impressive place. It just rises up out of the desert. And it is like a mountain right there in the middle of the desert with a flat top of a huge dimension from our point of view. I mean, the top from north to south is the length of 9 football fields. I mean, you can do a lot of stuff up there. And from east to west, it's about 3.5 football fields.
Herod was impressed by the impregnable qualities of the flat-topped plateau and turned it into a royal citadel. As a crowning touch, Herod built several ornate palaces, which boasted the latest in Roman design, with frescoes, a private bathhouse with hot and cold water pools, and many more luxurious chambers. But it was still a remote, inhospitable place. So food for 10,000 soldiers was stored in several narrow rooms. Without supplies, it was impossible to survive. These supplies were painstakingly hauled up the treacherous, winding snake path. And what would Herod do for water in this isolated spot?
Herod had constructed a series of cisterns, water collection pools, below the mountain and on top of the mountain, which collected the rainwater running off in the streams in the wintertime, which held 40,000 cubic meters of water. That's 10.5 million US gallons of water. And one big winter rain, and you catch all the water, And you filled your cisterns and you lived the whole year.
But Herod had built an impressive self-sufficient citadel. Little could this Roman puppet foresee that all his fortifications would one day be used against the very same forces they were now sheltering. Herod, the great builder of Masada, would die in the year 4 BCE, around the time Christ was born. Roman administration of Judea began to deteriorate. Over time, Masada declined as an important fortress. Instead, it became a minor outpost with a small Roman garrison. No one, least of all Herod, could have imagined that this prized, well-stocked summer fortress would serve as the perfect hideout for a group of radical Hebrews fleeing Jerusalem during the Jewish War in the year 66 of the Common Era. This ancient band of rebels, known as Sicarii, would come upon Masada and find very little in the way of resistance.
And at this time, it was that some of those that principally excited the people to go to war made an assault upon a certain fortress called Masada. They took it by treachery and slew the Romans that were there, and put others of their own party to keep it. Josephus, The Jewish War, Book 2. A different type of bandit sprang up in Jerusalem, known as Sicarii. This group murdered people in broad daylight, right in the middle of the city, mixing with the crowds, especially during the festivals. They would conceal small daggers beneath their garments and stealthily stab their opponents. Josephus, The Jewish War, Book 2.
The seeds of Jewish discontent can be traced back to the days of King Herod the Great. First came the appointment of inept Roman governors. Then an ever-increasing tax burden, followed by ever-increasing tension between the ruling class and the peasants.
The Romans are very fascinating in this way, namely that they are tremendously tolerant. They don't give a rip about what you believe. No, they don't care anything about how you carry on your private life. What they care about is, do you pay your taxes? And does it look like you're about to create any kind of revolution? You know? Are you meeting with groups? Are you partying late? Whatever. So if I tell my students, if you pay your taxes and go to bed early, the Romans are never going to bother you. But if you don't do that, they come down with a hammer.
Ancient Jewish prophecy had predicted the arrival of a Messiah coming from the land of Zion. As conditions continued to deteriorate in Judea, the idea of a Messiah gained increasing acceptance.
The tensions began then already in the days of Jesus, and the revolutionary fervor is reflected in the New Testament itself. So much so that many interpreters of the New Testament feel that even Jesus was a zealot, a crusader against the Roman oppression.
In general terms, the revolt should be seen to a great extent as a kind of Jewish parallel to the way in which Messianic fervor led the early Christians to come to believe that the Messiah had actually come in the person of Jesus.
Tension in the Holy Land is stretched tight between Roman oppression and eager expectations of deliverance at the hands of a Messiah who was to arrive at any moment. Riots break out in Jerusalem when the Roman administrator raids the Holy Temple in an effort to collect past taxes. The Romans are caught completely off guard.
The riot became a civil war. Nobody had expected that. And when in November of the year 66, the Romans sent the governor of Syria to quell it, which they should have done 6 months earlier, the Jewish forces defeated the Roman legion. And then it was war.
It is now that Masada, that desolate, remote, and lonely place, is about to take center stage in world history. A skeleton Roman garrison falls quickly to the fleeing Sicarii. While some of the Sicarii choose to return to Jerusalem to continue fighting the Romans, most will remain here for the rest of the Jewish war. They cannot know it now, but their final destiny awaits them here. It will come when the Romans finally track them down. At approximately the same time as the Romans are preparing to make their way to Masada, Mount Vesuvius erupts, blackening the sun throughout southern Europe. Across the Atlantic Ocean in North America, baby carriers made from juniper bark and animal hides are developed by Native American mothers. In Germany, soap is being introduced to the known Western world. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, the rebellion spreads when the city's residents attack the Roman public archives, destroying all records of all debts. The last stronghold of resistance in the Holy Land is a lonely outpost sitting high atop its perch in the deepest wilderness, Masada. Rome now dispatches its top commander of the Jewish war, Flavius Silva, into the Judean desert with 10,000 soldiers of the elite 10th Legion. There are less than 1,000 Sicarii men, women, and children huddled in stubborn resistance on top of the mesa.
Flavius Silva, when he saw that all the rest of the country was subdued in this war, got all his army together that lay in different places and made an expedition against it. This fortress was called Masada. Josephus, The Jewish War, Book 7.
Upon arriving, Flavius Silva quickly realizes that he will be unable to take Masada via the narrow snake path. He orders that a huge ramp be built to the top of the plateau.
He had 10,000 Jewish slaves, which he put to work, not on this side of the mountain, too high, on the other side of the mountain. He put them to work with wood and scaffolding and supports and dirt and buckets and a chain line, and he put them to work building the ramp up to the top.
For the next 2 years, Silva and his troops will make repeated assaults against the towering desert rock.
And at the same time, Silva ordered that great battering ram, which he had made to be brought hither and to be set against the wall, and to make frequent batteries against it. Josephus, The Jewish War, Book 8.
The Hebrew zealots are helpless in the face of this breach of the walls. It is now that they realize their days are numbered. With victory assured, the Romans seem content to wait until morning to confront the Sicarii.
The Romans, having now assistance from God, returned to their camp with joy and resolved to attack their enemies the very next day. Josephus, The Jewish War, Book 7.
When they return the following day, the Romans make the discovery that will take Masada into legend, into an undying place in history. Only 2 women and 5 children are left alive in the desert fortress. It seems 950 Sicarii have chosen mass suicide over Roman slavery. There has always been a tremendous amount of curiosity about the Masada story. It is, after all, one of the great tales of antiquity. But how can it ever be known what truly happened at Masada? There is one, and only one voice from that time, which stands as testimony today. It is the written record of the Jewish historian Josephus, But apparently he was just setting down what was told to him. He was not an eyewitness.
There are two Masadas as far as I am concerned. There is the Masada of archaeology on the rock at the Dead Sea and what has been restored, and then there is Josephus.
Josephus's physical descriptions have been confirmed by archaeology. Josephus spoke about the water, he spoke about the food, he spoke about the cisterns, he spoke about the walls, he spoke about the rooms, the palaces, the floors. His physical description is perfect. He spoke about the Romans, he spoke about their siege wall, he spoke about their camps. He spoke about the ramp. Insofar as you can confirm the background of the story, then archaeology can help you a lot. But it can't help you in what people said or what people did or what people thought. Only history can do that.
In an effort to unearth the truth about what happened here between the Romans and the Hebrew zealots, one man, Yigael Yadin, would take on the excavation of Masada. He was uniquely suited for the task.
Yigael Yadin was a great man, a great archaeologist, a great general, a great organizer, a brilliant writer, and most of all, he was lucky.
Yadin, when he set out to excavate Masada in 1963, embarked on certainly the most ambitious course in the history of modern biblical archaeology or modern Palestinian archaeology.
He made a very important contribution to the history of archaeology because for the first time he invited volunteers. The international response was overwhelming in the course of 2 seasons, 2 winter seasons, 62 and 63. 20,000 people dug at Masada.
When he mounted the excavation at Masada, Yigael Yadin captured the world's imagination. As a child, Yadin had climbed to the top of Masada. But Yadin was more than an archaeologist. He was also one of Israel's most brilliant and distinguished military commanders. He was chief of staff during Israel's War of Independence in 1948. And in 1967, he helped orchestrate Israel's lightning victories during the Six-Day War. And so, a modern Hebrew warrior was digging into the past to uncover the truth about a standoff between ancient Hebrew warriors and Roman centurions.
We dug in winter because it was lovely down in the Jordan Valley, dry, and the climate was just perfect for excavation. Food was trekked in from 50 miles away at nearby Arad, and we all lived in a base camp down where the Roman soldiers once lived. It was cold as heck at night, and we couldn't go out of the base camp area, and it was quite an experience to live in the barracks and military style that Yadin really cultivated. He treated us like his soldiers, and indeed we were his soldiers. But in selecting this site, which had been surveyed in the 50s by the Israeli Antiquities Department, Yadin was really about something else. Digging Masada was part of building a new national identity for the young Israeli state.
Yadin and his workers did succeed in confirming many of Josephus's descriptions, such as walls and the Roman ramp. They even found the remains of many well-preserved food items in Herod's narrow storerooms, such as dates, grains, pomegranates, and olives in a well-preserved state. But it was pottery that would yield one of the most startling discoveries of Yadin's dig. He found 11 fragments, each etched with names of individuals trapped atop Masada. Finding this fragment, with the name of Eleazar ben Yair on it, seems to confirm Josephus's account of the siege of Masada.
It was a very emotional moment in the dig when Professor Yadin found 11 pieces of pottery with names on them. Nicknames, actually. The baker's son, Fatso, the guy from the valley. but one of them was a real name, and that was Ben Yair. And we know him very well because Josephus wrote about him very well, and this is Elazar ben Yair, and he's the leader of the whole group there.
Miserable men indeed were they, whose distress forced them to slay their own wives and children with their own hands. They then chose 10 men by lot out of them to slay all the rest. When these 10 had without fear slain them all, they made the same rule for casting lots for themselves, that he whose lot was last should first kill the other 9, and after all should kill himself. Josephus, The Jewish War, Book 7.
Yadin's excavation was answering some age-old questions about Masada, but one mystery, the number of those trapped on the mountaintop by the Romans, still remained.
Well, one of the mysterious aspects of the excavations at Masada was the fact that there were very few inhabitants there. Only 25 skeletons have been found of the hundreds and hundreds, maybe nearly 1,000 zealots who were supposedly there, and that is a mystery, and that remains an unsolved question with regard to the excavations of Masada.
But what could have happened to all the countless numbers of bodies mentioned in Josephus's account? As with other digs at ancient ruins, archaeologists would confront a limitation of their craft, an open-ended question of what exactly happened at Masada.
The best you can hope for is what in fact you got. That the archaeology makes the history plausible. That when Josephus says they shot arrows and you find arrowheads. When Josephus says they rolled stones and you find stones. When Josephus says there were walls and you find walls, there were cisterns, you find cisterns, it makes the story plausible. Does it prove what happened? No. Does it help you to verify? No. But the negative is important. It doesn't contradict, and that's very important.
It's very easy to punch holes to say certain things are just plain implausible or just don't make any sense or cannot be reconciled with the archaeological evidence. That we can say very easily. But the problem is, once we do that, what are we left with? We're left with an account full of holes, and we have nothing to replace it with. Our fundamental problem is that we have only one account of what took place, and that's Josephus' account.
But for many scholars, the weakness in the entire Masada story rests upon the possible hidden agenda behind the writings of the historian Josephus. It is a central mystery in the story of Masada. There is only the account of one man, a man who was not even there. Moreover, it is possible that this man, the historian Josephus, may have had a hidden agenda when he was writing the story of Masada. So the key to the questions behind the Masada story may be hidden in Josephus's own military defeat 7 years earlier in the Jewish War. It is the final moments in the days of the doomed on top of Masada. Josephus tells us that Eleazar, leader of the Sicarii, gathers his people around him to persuade them that suicide is the only honorable way out.
Since we, long ago, my generous friends, resolved never to be servants to the Romans, nor to any other than to God himself, the time now comes that obliges us to make that resolution true in practice. Let our wives die before they are abused, and our children before they have tasted slavery. Josephus, The Jewish War, Book 7.
Josephus, the historian, is the only source for the suicide story. Even though he provides us with compelling details, we know he was not an eyewitness.
Everything we know about Masada we know from one source and one source only, and that, of course, is the reason we have so many mysteries. That source was a Jew named Joseph, the son of Mattathias, a high-born Jew, priestly Jew, born about the year 30 of the Common Era. He was appointed general in charge of Jewish forces of the Galilee when the war broke out.
Josephus and his men would eventually find themselves trapped in a Galilean cave. They enter into a suicide pact, a pact that would be virtually identical to the one Josephus would later write about for Masada. Except here, Josephus would not go through with it.
Since it is resolved among you that you will die, come on. Let us commit our mutual deaths to determination by lot. Yet he with another was left to the last. He persuaded him to trust his fidelity to him and to live as well as himself. Thus Josephus escaped in the war with the Romans. Josephus, the Jewish War, Book 3.
In the end, he found himself and his army trapped in a cave in the Galilee, near Nazareth. He engineered a mass suicide, just like Masada, except he cooked up the results and defected to the Romans. He stayed alive when they were dead.
Josephus has been called an apologist for the Jewish people. He's also been called a quisling, a traitor. And one of the reasons he would have said what he did about the mass suicide is to show the uselessness of the cause.
Not all scholars agree. Some believe that Josephus's decision not to commit suicide and to join the Roman ranks was not cowardly, but a matter of common sense, considering the overall plight of the Jews in Judea.
He realized that for the Jews to continue fighting was, in effect, suicide. That's what happened at Masada. They would wind up dead. They would wind up with the temple destroyed, and he was right. Now, is that treason or is that reason?
Traitor or pragmatist? It remains one of the great mysteries surrounding Josephus, and may have a direct bearing on the mystery of Masada itself. Back in the Galilean cave, where Josephus is trapped with his soldiers, his idea of surrendering to the Romans is firmly rejected, and his suicide pact is adopted. A pact which Josephus himself tells us he never consummates. Is it possible, therefore, that Josephus created the suicide story at Masada to make up for the fact that he never went through with his own suicide when he was trapped by the Romans? It is not just a matter of Josephus's credibility. The fact is, some archaeological evidence does not agree with the writings of Josephus. This problem also continues to trouble scholars and to cast doubt on many aspects of the Masada story.
It would seem from the archaeology of it and the absence of sufficient numbers of skeletal remains that most of the zealots had gone well before the Romans got there, and that the story in Josephus is an exaggeration, if not a fabrication.
Josephus and the archaeology do not appear to agree when it comes to the final days of Masada. The question is, how did Josephus learn about those final days? After all, he was not there.
There was an ancient woman and another who was of kin to Eleazar and superior to most women in prudence and learning, with 5 children who had concealed themselves in caverns, when the rest were intent upon the slaughter of one another. Josephus, the Jewish War, Book 7.
7 survivors. It is these people that tell Josephus about Masada. But apparently these 7 survivors were hiding out themselves during the final moments of the siege. Even they may not have been eyewitnesses.
Hiding out in the cisterns, they cannot possibly have heard the speeches. They cannot possibly have witnessed what people did when they went back to their families. They cannot possibly have witnessed what actually took place. They were hiding out in the cisterns. So if his account is true, the paradox is there was no way he or anybody else could have known that it was true.
Some of the archaeological evidence may tell a different story than Josephus. But even if his telling of the final desperate mass suicide at Masada is true, a mystery remains. What would compel the Sicarii rebels on top of Masada to violate one of the basic commandments of their religion, Judaism, and commit mass suicide?
The mystery to me as a scholar is whether or not they actually committed suicide in ancient times. This would tell me a tremendous amount about the kind of Jews who were occupying Masada and were the last defenders against the Romans in the revolt.
Was it mass suicide or fiction created by a historian trying to justify himself? It's a matter of life and death when we return to Mysteries of the Bible. After all these historical and archaeological questions have been asked, one enigma, one mystery about Masada remains, and it is a haunting one. What truly took place among the doomed men, women, and children clinging to their mountaintop high above the desert floor? Was it suicide or communal murder? Or did something entirely different spell the end for the last desperate holdouts of the Jewish war?
Let us spare nothing but our provisions, for they will be a testimonial when we are dead that we are not subdued for want of necessities, but that according to our original resolution, we have preferred death before slavery. Josephus, The Jewish War, Book 7.
Why did God allow this to happen? And Josephus says the answer is because the Jews sinned by rebelling. The act of rebellion was an act of sin, a rebellion against God. And God, as a result, supported the Romans. That's Josephus' theology. And that theology he puts in the mouth of Elazar ben Yair. And I cannot believe for a moment Elazar ben Yair would have said that, or would have said something like, God has rejected his people, which is a terrible thing for a Jew to say, and I can't believe he would have said it. I just find that it's inconceivable.
But if this account as set forth by Josephus is taken literally, the people at Masada did commit suicide, which would have been against their religion.
It's very hard to reconcile the idea of committing suicide with Jewish law. Jewish law does prescribe in certain circumstances that a person should give his or her life rather than commit certain transgressions, but that means you should allow yourself to be killed rather than violating those particular laws, not that you should kill yourself.
As Josephus describes, the last moments for the people trapped on top of Masada must have been heart-wrenching. His telling provides gripping drama as the Sicarii prepare to die.
Now as Eleazar was proceeding on in his exhortations, they all cut him off short and made haste to do the work. The husbands tenderly embraced their wives and took their children into their arms and gave the longest parting kisses to them with tears in their eyes. Josephus, The Jewish War, Book 7.
Some scholars view the death of the Sicarii on top of Masada not as suicide, but as a necessary step given their desperate situation.
When you consider the final acts of Masada, it's very important to be clear about this. It was not a mass suicide. It was a mass murder. And Josephus described how every man killed his wife and his children. Then chose lots, 10 of them chosen by Lot, killed all the other men as they lay down on the floor next to their wives and their children, and exposed their throats to the knife of the killer. How the 10 of them, having got rid of all the men, then chose the lots again with each other, so that the one person killed the 9. And at the very end, one person was left. One man killed himself, and that's one suicide. As for whether or not this is likely among a group of Orthodox Jews, this is the great puzzlement and the mystery of Masada. Scholars have tended to doubt it really happened.
So far, archaeological evidence does not support the number of suicides mentioned by Josephus. Nevertheless, what continues to captivate the world about Masada is people choosing to die for their ideals rather than surrender.
Well, the rebel struggle at Masada is a tremendous symbol of the ability of Jews to, on the one hand, protect themselves, on the other hand, to rise up against religious persecution, to rise up against their enemies and successfully defend themselves in the land of Israel. On the other hand, it does raise seriously this entire question of whether there aren't some times when this devotion can go a bit too far and turn into fanaticism.
In the end, the very nature of suicide lies at the center of the mystery of Masada. And a philosophical question on behalf of the trapped Sicarii remains. Whether it is more important to fight and die for one's dream, or to compromise and live to dream another day.
This is not a metaphor for successful resolution of conflict. You end up with dead people. That's not the way to go. And therefore, we've solved the last mystery of Masada. How come nobody else except Josephus Flavius ever told this story? Because Jewish literature did not approve of this story. It did not approve of a story which ends up with people killed when they should have been negotiating 3 or 4 stages back.
The truth of the text does not depend, at least for me, upon proving that the actual events as described or actually took place as described. Because the text is bigger than the events. The text is really about the meaning of history, not so much about history itself.
People still come to Masada to make the climb, to visit with ancient spirits, to see clearly, to feel majesty, to renew their allegiance to God, or swear their allegiance to a young nation. Perhaps even to renew their faith in their fellow human beings. And so Masada remains, deserted, rising from the silent desert floor, a fortress perched on its brow. And the ancient spirits are silent, and the ancient stones do not speak.